Good luck. Timber Crusher says, I want to see the on-chain wallet addresses for the US. It needs to be public, unlike Fort Knox. I agree. I just don't know how that happens. And I hope they do. I really hope they do. And kind of how I see this playing out. We're going to talk about the gold here in a sec too. But here's kind of how I see this playing out and how I think that this is going to tie into proof of reserves and how this is going to tie into absolute scarcity. And we get to a point where we can finally see the true value of Bitcoin. This is my prediction. So the US government has now announced that they're holding Bitcoin as a reserve, strategic reserve. And Trump, back in 2016 or 17, when he first took office, one of his main missions was to get rid of the Federal Reserve. You can bring up countless times where he's talked about it, talked about getting rid of the Federal Reserve and how openly he's talked about the U.S. Treasury taking over that responsibility, rolling things into the U.S. Treasury. This isn't just my opinion or some sort of conspiracy. This is stuff that he has actually talked about. He has a picture of Andrew Jackson hanging right behind him in the White House. Andrew Jackson was the last president who took out a central bank. So Trump's serious about this. And so when you roll it into the U.S. Treasury and you create a new U.S. dollar that's rolled out by the U.S. Treasury. So you have this new dollar, the new U.S. Treasury dollar, has nothing to do with the Federal Reserve, has nothing to do with the Federal Reserve notes that we're using today. It's a totally new thing. So a U.S. Treasury dollar that's backed by Bitcoin. So when you're backing something with Bitcoin, you're going to have to show the proof of reserve of that in order for people to be confident in buying your Treasury dollar, right? So that's the first step here. The U.S. is going to say, hey, we got a new dollar, the U.S. Treasury dollar. It's fully backed by Bitcoin. You can see the reserves yourself. It'll give you more confidence in holding U.S. Treasury dollars. And then what's going to happen from there? What plays out from there? If other countries are going to want people and other countries and companies to hold their dollars, they're going to have to do the same thing. Otherwise, people are going to say, okay, well, we got the US government here with the US Treasury dollar that's backed by Bitcoin that we can verify. Why would we hold any other currency? Why would we hold any other country's currency? Doesn't make any sense. Those are all backed by nothing. So the US is going to be the first one to do it. And then each country after that is going to be doing the same kind of thing. They're going to have a lot less Bitcoin. Their currency is probably going to be worth a lot less than the US. But that's the advantage that the US has now, is they're going to be the first one to do this. And they're going to get the most Bitcoin. At the end of the day, the entity with the most Bitcoin wins. Plain and simple. That could be a country, could be a company like MicroStrategy. I don't think any other entity is going to get more than 500,000 Bitcoin. So the entity with the most Bitcoin wins. And then you take it one step further. And you say, okay, well, what are these other countries backing their currencies with right now? Gold, kind of. Gold for the most part. China, Russia, India. That's what gives their citizens and other investors confidence in their currencies, that they have some gold there, right? So what did Trump do yesterday? He said, we're going to be holding this Bitcoin. It's not going to cost the tax dollars anything, at no expense to the taxpayer. That's what they're doing with the Bitcoin right now. No added expense to the taxpayer. And when there's no added expense to the taxpayer can't really bitch. Even though they don't understand what's happening here, even though they don't understand Bitcoin, they can't really complain because they're not paying any taxes for it. It's a brilliant strategy. Strategy, like that word, right? But let's talk about that. So what happens from there? I've seen two things since this was announced, of how the US could buy more Bitcoin without any additional expense to the taxpayer. So the first one was an idea from Jason Lowery, who, when we think back, Space Force created by Trump. When Space Force was created, that's when the Bitcoin hash rate just started ripping. So Jason Lowery came out and said, well, instead of adding more expenses to the taxpayer, let's take this out of the defense budget. So let's take some money out of our defense budget and buy Bitcoin, because as Lowry's talked about, Bitcoin is national defense. So that's one part. That's one theory, is that the US could actually take some money out of its defense budget and buy Bitcoin with that to add to its reserve. That's one way of doing it without new expenses to the taxpayer. But the second one here is even crazier. And so there's so many things at play here. There's strategy. Sailors known the Trumps for 20 years. You got Jason Lowry, who was part of Space Force, which Trump brought into office in 2019. He created Space Force. And then you have this guy, Eric Weiss, who was the one who apparently orange-pilled Michael Saylor. We'll go with that story, but he's an important player in this. What does he think? He says that selling, hold on. Let's get my email address out of here. He says, what's another way we could add Bitcoin to the reserve without adding more money to the taxpayer? How about this? Selling gold to buy Bitcoin is budget neutral. Eric Weiss, the guy who orange-pilled Michael Saylor. Part of the story here. Selling gold to buy Bitcoin is budget neutral. So think about what's been happening over these last couple of weeks. These are the things that you need to kind of just put together in your head, because nobody's going to come on TV and tell you these kinds of things, right? You got to kind of take the information and you got to connect the dots yourself. That's what we're doing right here. So this could be all just, hokey pokey stuff, but this is how I see it. So you think back a couple weeks ago when everybody started talking about Fort Knox. Is the gold there? Trump on the Air Force One saying, we're going to go to Fort Knox. We're going to go make sure the gold's there. And at the same time, we've seen all this gold coming over from London. There's been a huge kerfluffle over in London because their deliveries went from like a 1-day delivery to like 6 months or not even guaranteed delivery. So all that Bitcoin's going over to the US right now. Trump, Elon talking about auditing Fort Knox. Whole bunch of gold coming over from London to the US. So what's going to happen here? My opinion, they're going to go into Fort Knox. All the gold's going to be there, and they're going to start selling that gold for Bitcoin. It's just kind of like how everything's playing out step by step right now, almost as if it was planned. So they go into Fort Knox, they find this gold, they revalue it, they sell that gold, they buy a shitload of Bitcoin with it. Maybe they keep some gold, but they also buy Bitcoin with it. And then what happens? What happens to the price of gold then when one of the biggest holders of gold, because keep in mind, gold's very centralized, right? It's used by a lot of central banks around the world to essentially back the currency. So what happens when the biggest country on the planet starts selling its gold for Bitcoin? It's game over. That's what happens.